In this video, I'm going to explain how to set up your keyboard using VIAL. VIAL is very likable configuration software, and if you've got these ergonomic keyboards, especially the more open sourcey ones, then odds are that VIAL is the configuration software that you're going to want to use for it. VIAL is based off of QMK, and you can use QMK to really go down the code rabbit hole and configure your keyboard that way. But VIAL kind of gives you a nice user interface, and I kind of wanted to show you how to go deeper into the more advanced settings to set up the keyboard just right. Another reason why I'm making this video is because I tend to review a lot of these ergonomic keyboards, and I've just found that a large chunk of my collection is configured with VIAL, and I really didn't feel like repeating myself over and over again in all of my review videos. So the goal of this video really is to be the guide, such that I don't have to repeat myself in other content. Now, in this tutorial, I'll be using the VIAL app that you can download off the internet. I'll share a link in the show notes. But alternatively, you can also configure everything that I'm doing here inside of your browser. Just go to the vial.rocks website. I personally just kind of prefer the app, but you can also do all of this stuff without installing any software on your device. Now, in this particular case, I've got the app open, but you don't really see anything just yet. And that is because I've got a keyboard over here that's not plugged in. So let's do that. And then the main thing you should see instantly is that when I plug it in, the menu pops up, but also the layout of this keyboard is also something that you can see on screen. So you can see this is one of those ergo keyboards. There are 3 rows, kind of an aggressive pinky stagger, and there are 3 thumb buttons on each side. And you can totally see that being reflected in the UI as well. From here, you can start configuring, and it's all done with the GUI. So let's say I've got this button E over here. Maybe I want to change that to something else. I can go ahead and select R instead. And now if I were to actually use this one button, it would output R instead of E. And just to confirm that this indeed works, this is the R button, right? This is the E button that I just changed. It doesn't emit E anymore, it emits R. And what I can do now is I can go back, hit that button again, change it back to E, and this should fix it. Go back into Sublime Text, and when I now hit the E button a bunch of times, you can see the E character appears. So that's definitely kind of a nice thing about VIAL. The changes are made basically immediately. There's no need to flash the hardware or you have to wait or anything like that. The changes are made instantaneously, and that's definitely one of the things that I really appreciate about this software. But at this point, I should stress that we're really just getting started here. There's lots of things that I can assign to keys over here, and we've got these base characters, and that's already a good start. But there's lots of other stuff that we can also configure. But just to kind of explain the UI a little bit here, at the bottom there are these tabs that you can go ahead and click. And these are basically all sorts of behaviors that you can attach to one of these keys. However, typically when you're doing an ergo keyboard, there's way less keys than with a normal one. There's usually also some layers. And those layers you can select by going down all the numbers on top over here. Finally, there are also some tabs over here that kind of allow you to configure the more advanced things out there. So let's discuss one of the first things out there, which is the good old layer toggle. The whole idea behind a layer toggle is that typically for an ergo keyboard, you're not going to have enough keys such that all the keys are available right from the spot. So a trick that I like to do is I like to have a layer toggle on my thumb on this side, and that is going to turn the J, K, like the home resting position, you could say, the J, L, K, and the one above. It's going to turn all of those keys into the arrow cluster instead. And let's maybe first show that what it looks like in Sublime Text. So I can type normally, that's a sentence, and yeah, this is space, that's the thumb key on that side. But if I were now to hold this button down, suddenly I'm able to move the cursor. And if I were to remove my thumb press over there, and if I then start typing on these keys, oh, then I would just be dropping characters as I kind of would normally. Notice that this technique of doing a layer toggle and then switching the behavior of your hand, that is definitely something that in general takes a lot of practice. But the whole point of having a programmable, more ergonomic keyboard is that you can customize the keyboard just the way that you like. And I have at least found that by configuring my keyboard this way, my hand doesn't have to move as much. I can definitely imagine that some people like their arrow cluster, but I personally find it preferable not to move my hand as much. So how would you configure this? Well, in this particular case, you would go to the button in question, and then you would go to this tab down below here, and then you can effectively just select the layer that you're interested in. MO1 means that you're going to momentarily turn layer 1 on by keeping something pressed down. There are also some variations of this idea, by the way, that we'll get to, One of them is that you can say you want to just toggle by just hitting it real quick, and then you're in a new layer, and then when you press it again, you toggle it off. But in this particular case, I just want to momentarily go in when I keep something pressed down. In that case, I'm going to go to layer 1, so I can go to this layer 1 tab, and then you can see all the different buttons being configured. And in order to configure that, you go back to your basic tab at the beginning here. In this particular case, you would use the up arrow, the down arrow, etc. That's just something you can click together. And that's effectively it. This is how you can configure a layer toggle when you keep a button pressed down. And I think it's very common that that's behavior that you would assign to a thumb. Typically, one hand would have the space, and the other hand would have a thumb that's available to do all sorts of modifications, and one of those modifications could be a layer toggle. Now, on this keyboard, I have multiple layers. One layer is for the arrow cluster, but I also have a mouse layer, and that is something that QMK totally supports. If I go to layer 2, then it's not the arrow up-down, no, it's the mouse up-down movement. And I figured I might just show what that looks like. If I keep this button pressed down on my pinky over here, then you can see that I can actually control my mouse using the keyboard. I'm also able to, go to a menu and click around. I can configure this to be the left mouse button and that to be the right mouse button. But the way that this is configured is actually a little bit different and also just a little bit interesting. Before, I was using a momentary toggle, which means I have to keep something pressed down. But you'll also notice that that's the only behavior that I've attached to that one key. What you can also do is you can configure a key such that if I just tap it, it has one kind of behavior, and if I keep it pressed down, then it triggers the layer. And the nice thing about doing it that way is that you can kind of associate two behaviors to one single key. And let me maybe first show how that's configured on this keyboard. When I move my pinky to the left over here, that's kind of where the caps lock sort of is. That's where I basically move my backspace key. I use backspace all the time. I use caps lock never. So it makes a lot of sense to take a key that I never use and replace it with something that I use a lot. So okay, you can see me hit that button a few times, and that's effectively backspace. But now imagine that I keep the button pressed down. That's now a layer toggle. And now I can move the mouse cursor again, and I can right click, I can move it around, I can left click. And that is a different toggle for a layer switch, but it's definitely something I find incredibly useful. The way to configure that is you're gonna go to not an MO button over here, but what you wanna go to is a LT button that you can find at the bottom here. Note that when you hover over, you get some helpful text to help explain what the button actually does. But in this particular case, you can see LT2 and then a key in the description. So I'm just gonna hit that button to show you what it's like. If I keep it pressed down, I'm going to go to layer 2, but I still need to configure a key that will define the behavior if I tap it. I can hit inside of there, and then I can select backspace over here. And that's how you can configure this key to be both a layer toggle as well as backspace. A common philosophy that I tend to have is that I like to keep keys that I use a lot close to my resting position of my hand. That is sometimes also referred to as the Homerow. And the opinions kind of differ. It's also something you're going to have to figure out yourself as you're exploring a new keyboard. But I definitely kind of like it to use my pinky finger on this side for some common uses as well. So that's layers. They're super duper useful. But another thing I like to configure a lot as well is just some basic shortcuts. I always remember that shortcuts can be very awkward. Like you have to hit Alt Command and then you do something weird with your hand to also reach another key. And maybe you want to just associate a few of these very, very common shortcuts to just a single hit on a button that's really close by. And that's also something I've configured here. Just to give a quick demo, Alt Space, you can configure that for Raycast, which is this app that allows you to basically get a command palette on Mac. That's something I've associated to this button over here. So if I move my thumb outward and I hit that one button, let's see if I can get that rendered on this screen. There you go. I just have a quick shortcut, and from here I can, maybe toggle the full screen for an app, maybe open up another app, etc. That's something that's just a single key press now that's very easy to reach. And I've also got this other app that allows me to find all the clickable elements on the display, and then I just need to use a keyboard shortcut in order to figure out where I got to go. The name of this app is called Homerow, by the way. It's a really cool app. But yeah, those are two shortcuts that require some sort of modifier key like Command, Shift, Control, and Alt, and some combination of another key. And there are different ways that you could go about configuring that. For the simple shortcuts, I would go to this Quantum tab over here. And this is where you can configure all sorts of key presses together with Alt, Command, etc. I'll start with this one because it's a relatively easy one to understand. That one is Alt and then space. And the way that's configured is there is this one button over here, which is R Alt, and then you have to configure another key press. So you can click that, and just like with the layer switch before, R Alt is now the general modifier, and inside of that I gotta figure out some other key for the other behavior. In this particular case, I need to figure out what key is pressed together with Alt. I hit space, and that's enough for me to immediately configure this shortcut. Some shortcuts are combination of modifiers though, so it's not just Shift or Alt, no, it's Shift Alt combined and then a key. If you move further and further to the right on all of these buttons down below, you are going to notice that at some point you're also going to hit these combinations. So here's one, for example, for left shift and GUI. GUI would be command on Mac, for example. But you've also got right control and GUI, and there's all sorts of combinations here that you can combine. So in this case, let's go for right shift and GUI. And then it's basically the same thing, it's just that this indicates to VIAL that two modifiers will be active, and then I still need to combine that with space. But there you go, I've got that configured now as well. There are lots of other quantum keys here that allow you to combine some sort of shortcut. One thing to also observe is that you also can configure the hyper and the meh key. These tend to be kind of useful too because they allow you to generate kind of rare combinations of keys. Hyper stands for Control, Shift, Alt, and GUI all pressed at the same time. And the nice thing about being able to immediately press all those four buttons is that you're pretty sure that whenever you're going to make a keyboard shortcut for that you're not going to override some shortcut from the operating system or some sort of app that you're using. And the same thing holds for meh, which is Control, Shift, and Alt. How you want to configure this totally depends on your machine, but just know that if you're interested in doing modifier combinations of shortcuts, you can totally configure all of that stuff from the Quantum tab down below over here. Another thing you could also do, but I've personally found that I never really use it, is you can also configure something that's called a macro. If you want to configure that, you have to go to this macros tab that's on top. And what you can basically just do here is maybe configure some text that will be written. So I could maybe do something like, hello world. Let's say that that's some text that I might be interested in typing. In this particular case, I gotta hit save at the bottom. But let's say that's macro 1, and let's attach that to this one thumb button over here that I don't really use much, but I could go to macro. I can go to macro 0 over here, and just to be clear, macro 0, that's the thing I just configured. And if I were now to hit that button, hello world appears. So you can do other stuff with macros as well. You can kind of chain a lot of commands together. It can be useful. I end up not really using this. The one bit of advice that I do have here is to just resist the urge to put passwords in there. A keyboard is not a password manager, and it can be very tempting to just have a quick shortcut that allows you to fill in forms automatically, and I get that urge, but you don't want to be in this awkward situation where someone steals your keyboard and then has access to very important passwords. Like, I would definitely try to avoid that. So maybe like as a final demo to show you that macros are pretty flexible, I have updated my macro 0 such that first it is going to say hello world, that's text that it's going to just type. Then it's going to tap the enter key, and then it's again going to do some more text. And instead of just tapping the enter key, you can also configure any key as you would sort of normally, right? So that also means that you could trigger something in a layer that's somewhere else. There's lots of cool things you could do there. But the main thing is I'm chaining commands together now. And if I were now to trigger that macro, lo and behold, I am able to do some multi-line edits here. So, you know, definitely there are some cool things you could do here. One thing I can imagine is maybe you want to have like your name and your address, stuff like that. That's kind of useful to have close by. You can use a snippet editor for that, but you can also make a direct shortcut. That could also be useful. So let's now talk about this one fun party trick that I don't use that often, but I totally see the utility of it. And that is that you can configure a combo key. So as an example, let's go for Q, which is on one end of the keyboard, and let's go for this other one, P, which is at this other end of the keyboard. Whenever Q and P are pressed together, let's then pretend that there's going to be a different output, and let's say that's also going to trigger the macro that we just configured. This is now a combo key. And the interesting thing about this is something you can configure that is independent of the exact layout of your keyboard. You just have to press Q and P together, and that will trigger the behavior that we're interested in. So just for good measure, Q and P at the same time triggers that macro. There is a bit of a timing thing to be aware of here. It's not like you can keep Q pressed down and then hit P. As far as the keyboard is concerned, keeping something pressed down is different than a tap, and the whole point of a combo key is that you're tapping something at the same time, not holding something down and then tapping something. If you want to change that timing, by the way, that is something that you can also configure. If you go to the QMK settings tab, you'll see a combo tab, and in there you're going to be able to set the timeout period for combos. There's lots of these settings that you can set from here, by the way, but this combo setting is kind of specific to, as the name implies, combos. So again, this combo feature feels very powerful. I end up not really using it as much, basically because I'm very well versed in layers and doing shortcuts that way. But I do want to point this out because it does highlight how creative you can get with your keyboard. Stuff like this really can make it feel like the sky is the limit. And speaking of powerful features, this now kind of brings me to Homerow modifications. And I think I want to maybe just explain that behavior first a little bit. So I'm back in Sublime Text, and try and see something interesting that's happening here. Hello, space, world. Notice how the H and how the W over here, how they are capitalized, even though I did not hit any shift key. When I have my hands on the resting position, that's the home row, then all of those buttons, they kind of have two functionalities. I can tap a button, and that just gives me a character that's under it. But in the case of J, if I keep that pressed down, then that button becomes a shift. And all the letters that I might type with the other hand, they become capitalized. And this behavior is mirrored. If I tap on this side, I'm just going to press F a bunch. But if I keep F pressed down, then you're going to see me be able to type capital letters again. Now, clearly, if you've never really done typing this way before, this will take a while to get used to, especially when you combine it with layers and arrows and all that good stuff. But the main observation that I do have to get across is that if you are going down this path, hey, your hands have to move way less, and there's some ergonomic benefits to that. The way I've configured my board is that the innermost finger, index finger, that does the shift stuff. Then the D and the K buttons, that is command. Then I have Alt, and then I have Control. So from inside to out, Shift, Command, Alt, Control. It's mirrored, so I have it available on both of my hands, and hopefully you can also see how, for shortcut reasons, that's also going to be great. As a final demo, I want to show an extra thing. As I mentioned before, if I keep this button pressed down, then this hand does arrow stuff. I can move around, so to say. But on most operating systems, you can actually change the behavior of your arrow movement by keeping Shift, Command, and Alt pressed. So just to give an example, if I keep Shift pressed down by holding down the F modifier, that will totally allow me to select some text. If I keep F and Command selected, then doing a single up movement can select an entire file. Another thing that's kind of interesting is if I keep Alt pressed down, then I can very easily skip all these different words. Normally, you would go character by character, but by keeping Alt pressed down, you can suddenly make these interesting jumps. And if I want to select a word, then I just gotta keep F pressed down as well. A lot of this takes a bunch of training, but I do really hope that you can appreciate just how little my hands have to move in order to perform all of those actions. So hopefully this is pretty exciting for you, so I'm gonna now show you how to configure this, because there is actually more than one way to go about it. So, as a demo, let's use that same Quantum tab as before, and let's go to this over here. I'm gonna hit the behavior that Alt becomes a modifier or a key can be pressed. So I'm just gonna configure S if it's a press and Alt if it's being pressed down. That should now be configured, but I want to point out this one awkward side effect that we should be aware of. So that's me typing the word super slowly. And let's now type the word super fast. You're going to notice that I didn't type S and then U, and instead I have this other character. And that's also kind of the behavior for Alt. Kind of the whole point of Alt is that you can have access to all these sort of special characters that you normally wouldn't find on your keyboard. And that's a bit of a conundrum, because you kind of get into this mode of, if you're typing super quick, you might by accident trigger all these characters that you're just not interested in. And this behavior doesn't just hold for Alt. You kind of have this behavior for all of your Homerow modifiers. To figure out what's going to be working out best for you, it tends to be a bit of trial and error. I have personally found it best to definitely keep Command and Shift around and maybe Control as well. But on my base layer, I just have Alt turned off. And then on my arrow cluster, the thing that I do there is I just configure left shift, GUI, Alt, and Control directly, and I will never hit the normal characters when I'm in that modifier mode. Whenever I'm doing something with my arrow cluster, I don't have to worry about pressing A or Alt or like having a timing issue there. That's just kind of the way that I've been able to figure that out for me. In theory, there is also a setting for this, and that is that you could go to QMK settings, you could go to the tap hold section over here, and you can change the tapping term in an attempt to address this. On all of my boards though, that setting feels kind of broken. So that could be a bug on my end, but I have read on some forums that other people also experience some issues. So this is a nice little segue to maybe explain this other behavior that you can configure, which is that you can also assign a tap dance key, which can also be used as a Homerow modifier. To explain that, what is a tap dance key? Well, you can configure a key to have different behavior depending on if you're just tapping it once, if you're holding it down, if you're tapping it twice in quick succession, or if you're tapping it and then holding it. In theory, you could have 4 behaviors assigned to one button that way. Now, the benefit of tap dancing keys in this particular case is that the difference between tapping and holding can be configured for each of those tapping keys individually. So I've got this one tap dance key over here, where on tap it's a D, and on hold it's a GUI or command. And the tapping term for that is specific to that key. So for pressing D or Command, I have configured a very specific tap dancing key over there that can really be finely tuned for just that one key. And the ability to have timing be specific to a key in this case for a Homerow modifier is super duper nice, because in theory that also means that if your index finger and your ring finger and your middle finger are like strong and quick, you can have a relatively short tapping term for that, but if your pinky is a little bit weaker and needs to hold it down for longer, then you can set it for longer as well. That is definitely stuff that you could configure if you're interested to use these tap dancing keys. Note, by the way, that you do have a limit. You can only use so many of these tap dancing keys. Most keyboards are configured in a nice way such that that's not an issue, but it's good to be aware of at least. So, as far as configuration goes, I think I've explained the gist of it at this point. It feels like I really touched most of the topics that I'm interested in. I guess like one thing that's good to know if you go to the settings, there are lots of little details that you can tweak. So with the mouse movement, for example, how fast does the mouse actually move around the screen? That's stuff that you can configure. But there's one extra thing I do want to show that is a little bit dependent on the keyboard that you are configuring. The keyboard that I've just shown you is relatively bland. It's not got any bells and whistles. It really just has a few keys on it. But there are keyboards that actually do offer a fair bit more. For example, let's take this Elora keyboard. It has way more buttons, and it also has some extra features on the side. The Elora keyboard is a little bit special just because it's so dang hackable. You can add different modules, and all those modules are in theory configurable. One of those items is this encoder button over here that I can turn. Depending on the keyboard, you are going to have to find in the interface over here where exactly this turning knob is. But one of the things that you can do is you can define the behavior of turning the wheel one way and turning the wheel the other way. And one thing I've been able to configure, if you go to App Media and Mouse Behavior, then you can actually find scrolling behavior as well. And like the weirdest little demo, if I tweak it here, you can totally see that, I can scroll. That's like a thing you can configure. There's mouse movement and stuff. It's not the most useful thing that I've configured here, but just as a demo, that is something you can totally do. And then another thing you're also going to notice with this one particular keyboard is that it also has lighting. That's a new tab that's opened up because this keyboard also has some LEDs at the bottom that you can go ahead and configure. I like to just keep it simple. I like to give it a solid color. But there are also these settings where you can kind of have a keyboard that's sort of breathing as an indicator that it's on. Sometimes you're also able to set the brightness. It kind of depends on the setting. I think for a solid color, I am able to make it brighter and less bright. But for some of these other things that you can program, like breathing movements, then you might not be able to change it. Some keyboards go a step further than just having a bit of underglow. And then this keyboard will be a nice example of that. This keyboard has underglow, but it also has some LEDs under the keycaps themselves that also allow you to show some pretty things, I suppose. The one thing that is good to be aware of, though, is that although VIAL does allow you to configure the color, the way that the color is configured is global. So as far as I'm aware, you cannot set the color per key, for example. Some more advanced keyboards do allow you to do that, and I think if you were willing to go down into the QMK code yourself and really compile some stuff and flash it onto the device, you might also be able to do that, but you're not going to be able to configure that from VIAL. It's a bit of a bummer, but then I also feel that RGB lighting is also, kind of not that important. After all, when I'm working, I'm looking at the screen, and typically the whole point of being a good typist is not to look at your keyboard all day. So I can definitely live with this fact, but it's good to know if you're interested in buying maybe a VIAL keyboard, you're not going to be able to configure all of these buttons with RGB. Yeah, not going to be able to do that. So there you go. This was an overview of stuff that you can configure with VIAL. I'm going to refer to this video in a bunch of my review videos. But one thing I do hope mainly is that you can look at VIAL and kind of go, hey, this is a really cool project. It's great that this exists. You can definitely imagine that then some of these keyboards become a whole lot cheaper. As a vendor, there's less stuff you got to worry about. You don't have to make a huge user interface work with your device. You can just kind of plug into existing solutions. And there's a lot of stuff that you can nicely configure with this GUI called VIAL. I hope this was useful, and if nothing else, I also hope that it might motivate you to explore ergonomic keyboards, because I have found that they do make my programming experience much, much nicer. Thanks for listening.